Great to see you here on Now Write Your Book Summit. My name is Stephen Sonsino, and this is the penultimate video. This is the penultimate live stream in the summit. I am exhausted. However, I've had a blast reviewing these interviews with amazing best-selling authors and publishers. I hope you have too. If you're watching live, congratulations. If you've seen every single one of these with me, I applaud you. Some of you I know, but it'd be great to find out, those of you watching the replay, what you thought of some of the earlier ones. As we get to the end here, it's time to reflect on all of the different aspects of what we've touched on. But maybe we'll do that in another video. We'll do that at the end of Steve Piersanti's video, which is coming up, the final video in this series. Karen Dillon was a former editor of Harvard Business Review. I first met her when she came to London Business School. She was looking for other authors to work with and to write articles and books for Harvard. And I've stayed in touch with her ever since. And since then, she's written a number of best-selling books in collaboration with people like Clayton Christensen, sadly, who passed away earlier this year. And this particular book grew out of a Harvard article. How will you measure your life? I mean, that's a killer title, isn't it? I mean, that's an amazing title, a thought-provoking title that will stop you in your tracks as you walk past the shelves in the bookstore, as you're scrolling through Amazon or whichever online bookstore you're reviewing. How will you measure your life? Titles play such an important part. And I think as we reach the conclusion of the summit, we can see titles have played such an important part, right from LYNDA Gratton through Steve Berry this morning. So it's really important that you spend a lot of time thinking about your title. But more so than the publishing of your book, whether you choose mainstream or self-publishing, for me now, as we reach this point, the next thing to be focusing on is on writing your book and the quality of the writing. So I thought it would be useful to speak to a professional journalist, Karen Dillon, because she will help us to see how we can engage and inspire our readers. And partly that's going to be through storytelling, but also it's through the quality of our writing. And I guess I can give you a very practical tip right now, and that's to get hold of something like this. This is the Financial Times Style Guide. And you can see it's quite extensive in terms of what it goes into. It talks about spellings, it talks about grammar, it talks about language. The Economist also has one of these. I urge you, get a style guide. What it means is it helps you to format your writing. So all the basics are covered. Do you have S spellings or Z spellings? This is very pragmatic, very basic level stuff. And decide to follow a style guide and then stick to it. If you decide that you're not going, do you remember Star Trek? To boldly go. This is a split infinitive. Normally we say to go boldly or boldly to go. But the style guide will help you to decide or to follow a particular style of writing. But it's very pragmatic. Karen Dillon is going to talk to us about and share with you some ideas for how to write in an extremely engaging and a very inspiring way. So make comments in the chat, and I'll answer your questions later on. If you capture your insights and your comments and your takeaways as we go through, I'll make sure we include those in the description, in the show notes at the end of this interview summit. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you make of this. This is very different from some of the other interviews that you've seen in the summit. Please let me introduce you to Karen Dillon. Karen Dillon, former editor of Harvard Business Review, which is where we first originally met. But you have written with Clayton Christensen and some other co-authors some really profound and quite moving books, and we'll talk about them in a minute. I mean, how will you measure your life? I mean, that's just a killer question. We'll get to that in a minute. So the quality of your writing is amazing, and so it should be, having been editor of Harvard Business Review, deputy editor, if I remember rightly, of Inc. magazine, but also you launched and published The American Lawyer, which I'm not a lawyer, but I understand from my friends who are that it really hit the nerve, hit a spot at a particular valid time. So you have always written, it seems to me, and now you're an editorial advisor for an amazing organization, Banyan Family Advisors. I'm not sure I've got the name right. Banyan Global Family Business Advisors. So you have always written. Last week you were on the TED stage talking about one of your stories. So storytelling, and particularly perhaps in written form, has always been a part of your life. You're speaking on stages, you're called on as an advisor, left, right, and center all over the world. I mean, we met at London Business School. You were on some amazing global tour to try and encourage new writers to come in. And still the question comes to my mind, why books? I mean, editor of some profoundly important magazines. Why, Karen, why write a book?
Well, I always say to people, a book is not for the faint of heart. It's the hardest act of writing that you can do. It takes a long time. Connecting all the threads is very difficult. A book to me is like 10 or 12 or 13 great magazine articles put together. The bar is very high. But I actually believe that from the various kinds of publications I've done, magazine articles, podcasts, speaking on stage, a book is when you have a person fully. You've connected with them, and they are physically touching and engaging and thinking about your idea. And so I think for the deepest connection with a reader, with someone who might be interested in your ideas, if you have them to sit down and take time to read a book, you have their full concentration in a way that you probably don't if they're doing something on their phone or reading on a screen or flipping through something really quickly. So I think a book is an opportunity to have a very meaningful idea exchange with readers who either might be interested in your idea or might learn to be interested in your idea in a way that is quite profound. And I think there's something powerful. Books are enduring. They're there. They're physically on shelves. They can be pulled down or referred to again. Magazines and websites and things tend to be far more ephemeral. So it is a really, really good way to write the definitive thing you want to write, at least in the beginning, about your idea. But it's a hard process.
I hear what you say about the how difficult it is, and over such a sustained period of time. I mean, you know the amount of effort that goes into a single Harvard Review article. So to craft 12 of those, that's a stunning effort of work. But I absolutely love what you say about that connection. Because, I mean, even if someone is reading on a Kindle or some other platform, I love the idea that they're actually holding your work or physically engage with it as well as mentally. And this idea that, your words are in their head and speaking to them and nudging them down a particular path. So they can be very persuasive tools. I'm reminded of Jay Conger, his work on the necessary art of persuasion, much more about the emotional side of persuasion than people tend to think. It's not at all just a rational argument, a set of propositions. And in a book, you have the luxury to be able to go down that path. You can explore these different things. And you did that brilliantly. We'll leave aside the Harvard Guide to Office Politics for now. Okay. Great collection of ideas and themes, and I love that and learned a lot from it too. I won't say any more. But how will you measure your life? I'm a sucker for a great title, and that question is a great question. So how did that book initially come up? How did the meeting come up? And I'm thinking a little bit, I guess, about the car park story and your TED piece. But how did that connection come up, and why did you feel so embedded in that story to want to be able to tell it? Can you tell that story?
Sure. So it was, almost 10 years ago now. I think it was 2010 that I was the editor of the Harvard Business Review magazine. And I really was just looking for an extra article to fill a double issue that we did at that time every July, August. And I was looking for something relatively easy because, as we said, every article is its own sort of craft and difficult. So I was casting around for a relatively quick idea. And I just had heard through the grapevine that Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen had done a talk to the graduating class, the soon-to-be graduating class of business school students, 2010. And I remember thinking, that'll be interesting because that particular class had applied to business school when the economy was thriving, 2008. Entered business school, and a few weeks later, the economy fell out. And I thought, well, they would have had 2 years to think about, their own version of success and what that means while they were hermetically sealed at Harvard Business School. So what he had to say to them probably was interesting. But that was all I knew. And I thought, that's kind of an essay. I can turn it into something. He's very well known, but I didn't really know him. I just knew his reputation because he's one of the most well-known Harvard Business School professors.
Disruptive innovation, all of that stream of work.
Yes. the fastest thing I say to people to establish how well known he was is his business book called The Innovator's Dilemma, which was his original idea on the theory of disruptive innovation, is the only business book that Steve Jobs kept on his bookshelf. So he was profoundly influential. That much I knew, and I knew he was a nice guy, but I didn't know him personally. I called his office and said, I heard you gave this talk. Could I come over and we'll turn it into an essay of some sort? And what I now know was shocking and surprising is they said, yes, come over right away, because he's an incredibly busy guy. But I did. I turned up with just my mind on, let's get this article done. I had a digital recorder. I was going to record. I was going to ask him questions, record whatever he said, and then I would help him draft it into an essay. My mind, it was, let's get this going. I turned up in his office and again, met him really for the first time. And we had a conversation about business theory, which may sound very boring, but I found it profoundly moving. What we talked about, the basic idea that he talked to the students about, was that he's given his best thinking for all these classes that he's taught all semester to his students so they can make good decisions in business. But he thinks it's even more important that they make good decisions in their life. So can you use these theories about what causes what to happen, what the consequences of certain choices are in building yourself a healthy, strong, happy life? And what we talked about that day, it sounds so obscure, but it just resonated with me. His talk was really for 25 or 30-year-olds, people who were at Harvard Business School. And I was in my early 40s, I think, at that point. And it just hit me as if it were for me. It was asking questions like, your strategy is built around how you allocate your resources. If you don't allocate your resources to the strategy that's most important to you, you're not fulfilling your strategy. So as I left there an hour and a half later, I had sort of washed away all the thoughts of getting that article written quickly and students. And I just was thinking about how what we talked about had applied to me. And I did stand in the Harvard Business School parking lot without putting my keys in the car for a stupidly long time, thinking about that was me. My resource allocation was nowhere close to what I would say my strategy was. And it was the beginning of both working on an article that was profoundly meaningful to me personally and to Clay as well. But a dramatic change in my own life. A year later, having thought through that, ended up resigning from Harvard Business School and Business Review and sort of replanting my life in the UK, as you know, for a couple of years. But because what he said had affected me, I thought it was profoundly true that if you don't be very deliberate about the choices you make in your own life, then you will end up in a place that you don't want to end up. And that article, which we called How Will You Measure Your Life, was the first article in Harvard Business Review to go viral. It was right when the web was really kicking off, and it went all over the world, million views really quickly. And I think we just knew that what had touched me had touched so many readers as well. And we eventually went on to turn it into a full book.
Yeah. So a couple of things that in what you say. Firstly, it's a fantastic story, that sort of turning point story, and you tell those really well. And that's perhaps something we'll come back to if we have time, because I think too many people see writing books and articles and PDFs and white papers as a string of bullet points, and that's not what it is at all. But this question, this at the heart of the book, at the heart of the article, it seems to me if we can help people to really identify what's at the core of what it is they want to say, as you said a moment ago, something that's meaningful to them that you want to share with the world, your best knowledge, your best story, whatever it might be. That I think is a key learning point. And questions inherently, aren't they, have some measure of attraction, because you immediately start thinking of the answer. It's what we do in the lecture theatre, in the seminar room, in coaching and consulting. So that is a big lesson, a big takeaway. You're also then potentially, as you craft this article, I can understand that. How was a decision to turn it into a book, and then how did that come about? What was your process of working with Clay like?
So there were a number of extraordinary events that probably made this a little unusual, but the article came out in the July-August issue of 2010, which was out in late June of that year. And in early July, Clay had a stroke, which rendered his ability to speak and write only. He looked perfect. His brain was perfect. Just his ability to speak and write was profoundly affected. So at the same time that we now know we have a viral hit that's touched a nerve, he's lost his own ability to speak and write in a way. And he's a beautiful speaker and writer. So the combination was very powerful. Let's get together and talk about should we and can we and how could we work on this together. It added extra challenges, but it became very clear that that we first took time to say, do we have enough to say? Is there, did we say it all in the magazine article? And the answer often, by the way, is yes. A magazine article is the right amount of space and time.
I've seen quite a few of those, quite a few books that have outstayed their welcome.
They do. I think it's because there's this temptation that a book is better, bigger, more lasting, and I get that. But I think a book that people stop reading is not better and bigger and more lasting. It's a negative. But anyway, so we spent a lot of time thinking, did we have more to say than the magazine article? And we concluded that we did. And then we sketched out what could we say. And I was still not ready to fully jump into working with him. I just wanted to help him think about his idea. And then over the course of the next year, we together with another co-author, James Allworth, who was one of his students, sketched out a full book. So it took time. And I think that's a really important step. Do we really have a book's worth of material, or have we stretched out an article? And we took time to answer that question. And we still wrote a relatively short book. And I think that was the right length for that book as well.
And the response to the book as well was also huge. You're right. It came out, I think, 2012. HarperCollins, I think, published it. Highly regarded. I'm pretty sure it was a bestseller. Was it New York Times bestseller?
It was, yes. It was New York Times for a few weeks, yes.
So that's, again, that's a measure of people strolling into bookstores. It's not a given that that's going to happen. I know a lot of people buy their way onto some of these lists, and publishers can sort of nudge it and massage it. But that's, on the whole, that's not easy to do. You then, I guess, 2-3 years before competing against Luck. So presumably the mechanism, the process had worked quite well. Clay was comfortable with that, was comfortable with the relationship. Tell me about the move toward, into the next book, competing against Luck. How did that come about?
Sure. So when How We Measure Your Life came out, I was actually by then living in London, and sort of weirdly unaware of all the hoopla in the United States about the book. And I saw the bestseller list, and in some ways, it was a great way to be a first-time author, co-author on the bestseller list, because I didn't get caught up in the hype, but it was a very cool experience and sort of remotely living through it. By the time we started working on the next book, Competing Against Luck, I had moved back to the U.S. and Clay and I had just built a really strong rapport. What I always say to Clay, the value I think that I bring to him as his co-author is, I think of myself as a reasonably bright person, but I'm not an expert in all the things he's an expert in. So I need to ask him a lot of questions so I can understand what he's talking about. And the teacher in him comes out. So if I don't get it, or I come back around, or I've drafted something that doesn't quite explain it well, then he has failed to teach me well, and I failed to ask good questions. So our rapport really became about understanding the basic idea that he was trying to convey in the book, which is always, in his case, a theory. He has a business theory that he thinks is really important to share, but bringing it to life for people and asking all the relevant questions around that. So our sessions together tended to be my asking lots of questions, thinking about it, going away, drafting something, showing him, but it was more a collaboration of understanding. And so his theory became the underpinnings, the skeleton for the whole thing. And then because I wanted to understand it and find it interesting and entertaining, would often add stories. I would interview people, or I would tell stories in a different way, because I know I connect with stories as I know readers would. So I would come back and have a story to add to it. Does that one illustrate it well? Yes or no? And we'd build it together. So it was a building process, but it wasn't two of us sitting at the keyboard together or editing each other back and forth. It was a conversation that I tried to capture eventually in the draft of the book.
Awesome. And certainly in the early days, right after that, I'm sure there were all sorts of life challenges for the family as a whole to deal with someone who's just had a stroke. I know about that. But then to transform that into a working communication of minds, that's that there must have been moments when you thought, what have you got into? Any moments there like that?
Well, probably more in the first book than the second book, because his speech was pretty recovered by the second book. But one thing that was really helpful on both sides is we just built trust very quickly. So he had no shame about not finding a word and me asking the word and me filling in. Like we just learned that there was goodwill here. So there was no pretense on anyone's side. So he still does it sometimes when he speaks, he'll tell the audience that sometimes he gets distracted by the faces and he'll look down to remember the word he wants. And it's just a moment, just like a little glitch in the computer. And we learned that and worked through that. And trust became built very quickly. And I think we both knew we both wanted this to be done. We wanted it to be done well, and we wanted to work together. And that helps build a really strong relationship.
Yeah. I guess competing against luck isn't quite in the same category, I won't say league, as How Will You Measure Your Life, because it's still very much a story, but it's still very much rooted in his work on innovation and customer choice. I think those words are there in the subtitle. How did you both decide there was something here to tell? You know, thinking about the work went into the first book, How Will You Measure Your Life, there is something here to tell. Well, how did that emerge? How did the idea emerge? Because you're, as you say, two bright sparks. I'm intrigued. How did that idea come through?
So Measure Your Life was really the extraordinary book. It was unusual for Clay. He's written 10, 12 books that are all based on business theory. And, again, good books, interesting books, but not for armchair, Sunday morning reads on Father's Day. Unless you're really hardcore Clay fan. So Measure Your Life, we really wrote it because it was for me and it was for my children and it was for his students. It was for a wide audience. And that was the exception, truly. Still based in theory, but it was intended to be a wide interest publication. When we were writing Measure Your Life, there was one of his theories, the theory of jobs to be done, which is a theory of how people make choices about whether to purchase this product or that product, hadn't been explored enough. And he was really interested in exploring it further. And it was clear, we built one chapter in the first book around it, but it felt like we had a lot more to say from a purely business perspective. How can we explain this theory better, broader, and its applicability to a wider audience so they can use it in innovation, his core subject. So though it was far off of the far more personal book that we had written with Measure Your Life, it was sort of the right next step in the series of books that Clay has written, using his theories to amplify an idea. So it was back to business. It was back to my hardcore Harvard Business Review hat and back to his professor hat, but also attempting to bring to life an idea that we thought people could use in making good choices in their business and then in their innovation.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit, before we get into prosperity paradox, which I'm really excited to unpack with you, because of the connection with Harvard. I think these are HarperCollins books, weren't they? They weren't published by Harvard
Yes.
Business Press. Tell me about that relationship, because presumably working with another publisher was different for you. I don't know. How was that relationship?
It was actually a good story of longevity in the business. The editor at HarperCollins is a woman called Hollis Heimbach, and she had been my colleague and peer at Harvard Business Review for years. She was head of the book division of Harvard Business Review. So I knew her well and trusted her. She had edited Clay in the past, both when he had written for Harvard Business Review and previously for HarperCollins. So it was just a very comfortable and natural fit. In fact, so we've done the past 3 books have all been with her, and it's just a really good team. So I think that was not as foreign as it might have seemed. It was actually a happy and comfortable confluence of old relationships that worked really well together.
Very good. And so I mean, I don't want to get into the minutiae of publishing, but so you're then dealing with, I guess, the overlapping Venn diagram of authors with proofs and editing that side, but the whole downstream printing side of it, that's somebody else's can.
Yes, as well. You know that publishing is getting the book to the press is like step number 1, and that's a lot of work and many iterations that the average person couldn't bear to tape their eyes open to do. Reviewing at a minutia level. But publishing a book is only the first, I'd say, half of the battle of getting the idea out. There's so much work to be done after the book comes out and promoting it and talking about the ideas and sharing it with people. So all of that becomes a collaborative effort of the team. But authors have to have the will to stick with the project through all of those stages. Or if a book falls in a forest, right? If people don't read it, if they don't find it, they'll never know the ideas in it. So it's hard work to do everything associated with the book getting published, and then all the work that comes after as well.
Absolutely. Let me also say, and maybe we can talk about this afterwards. And one of the amazing things that's happening is the whole burgeoning self-publishing platforms. You can do it through Amazon now. I half wonder whether some of the mainstream publishers could be veering off course or losing it. But what I'm hearing from you is that tremendous help from HarperCollins, particularly to manage the process, to get the book out, and to support you on that, because you do hear stories of folks who were just not helped on the marketing side at all. And I've certainly had some experience of that myself.
It's definitely true. Definitely true in the industry, and it's true. Sadly true. I think more often than authors realize. You think that they've invested in your book and they're going to publish your book, and then they're of course going to invest in marketing it. But they have a portfolio. Most publishers have a portfolio approach, so they need to have something hit, but 3 cannot hit as long as something hits. So interest can wane very quickly. We have found, perhaps because Clay is such a big name and it gets so much attention right away, that HarperCollins is a great partner. We've also found that Harvard Business Review is a great partner, even though they haven't published the book. We've found ways to collaborate together. We've written an article every time that goes with the book. So the relationships that Clay and I both have been really important to things not falling off the cliff of being noticed. But it's a very tough industry, and I think it's very easy for some. I've worked on other books where I know equal amount of work has gone into it. It's a good idea, just perhaps doesn't have the biggest name associated with it, and it fades a little more quickly. And it's sad because equally good quality, just not the fame. Publishers are very fickle, I think.
Yeah. I think there's definitely something in what you say, and I think there's a whole other conversation about how we bring some of that clarity of thought. I love what you're saying about that germ of the idea that holds the whole thing, because I think if you can communicate that simple idea, that single idea, through to a publisher or on the marketing side, through to press, however you want to market your book, then I think it will catch. And I loved your point about the viral nature of the article, the original article, How Will You Measure Your Life? Because presumably many people around the world had not come across Harvard or Clay. So it was the value of the idea itself that got spread, not necessarily the relationships and so on. Let me switch into Prosperity Paradox. That's the new book that's coming out this year, 2019. How did that come about? Of course, I need to ask you that question. And what now? What do you hope for the book? So tell me about the genesis of Prosperity Paradox first.
So this is the third time I've co-authored with Clay, and I have told him several times over the past years I'm semi-retired. I'm good. I've been happy. And this case, just the book idea just sort of grabbed me by the collars. Clay has often chosen to work with a former student who's really interested in one of his theories and wants to apply it in a particular arena. And in this case, he had a former student who had stayed on from Harvard Business School to be a fellow in something called the Forum for Growth and Innovation at Harvard Business School, which is a think tank within Harvard Business School to focus on innovation. And Afosa Ojimo had stayed on to work in Forum for Growth and Innovation. And he was applying Clay's theories to development, to developing some of the poorest economies in the world. And as is often true, really bright people aren't necessarily instantly predisposed to writing a book. It's harder. You think about it from an academic standpoint, not from a reader standpoint. So they were struggling a little together to draft something that would be interesting to a wide audience, even though it was really smart and really thoughtful. And I said I would help them with the book proposal, which, is a process of summarizing your book enough so that it gets purchased by a publisher. And that was it. I would get the proposal and wish them well and be happy that I had helped give birth to this book in some small way. And in the process of starting to work with both of them on this idea, I just fell in love with it. It was so exciting to work on a book that, maybe a nice contrast to the last book, which was hardcore business book about innovation and creating products for customers. This is a book about how we can solve one of the world's great problems, turning some of the most desperately poor parts of the world into more prosperous parts of the world. And I just fell in love with the stories. I fell in love with the idea. I just really clicked with, again, a co-author I had not really met before, Afosa Ojimo, who is graduated, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago from Harvard Business School, but still relatively young. He's from Nigeria originally. It was just a very exciting collaboration. So I came out of my self-declared semi-retirement from writing books and wrote another book and really enjoyed the process.
Yeah. So again, just briefly, if you would encapsulate the concept here, because I think that's worth retelling. The prosperity paradox. What is it? How does it capture your imagination?
So the idea, the title refers to the prosperity paradox, the very basic fact that for decades, the world has spent trillions of dollars on sending money to aid poor communities in all forms. Some are development, some are humanitarian, but we've spent a lot of money trying to fix poverty. We see the visible signs of poverty and we try to provide resources to fix it. But the reality is the needle on poverty in most of the world has not moved almost at all. There are some places in the continent of Africa that are even far poorer than they were before we started pouring money in. The only place that has had some real notable progress is China. And that tends to skew all of the rest of the stats. So the world is still faced with enduring poverty in spite of really smart people, really good intentions, and a lot of money being spent to fix it. So the fundamental paradox is the thing we're naturally doing to solve poverty is not solving poverty, but we ask a different question instead. What if we stopped focusing on fixing poverty and instead try to understand, well, what generates prosperity? It's a slightly different thing. It's not just getting rid of poverty, but it's actually creating an engine. And so the answer we hope we've provided in the book is that there are certain things that you can do, economies can do that focus on innovation as kind of a pull of prosperity into what would otherwise seem to be desperate economies. The best example is America in the 1850s was a terrible country by almost all measures. It was poorer than Bangladesh is today. Child labor, people's lifespans were really short. It was on paper one of the most impoverished countries in the world. But we forget that because so much happened in the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century that changed that fueled the American innovation engine. So we're applying those principles to other parts of the world as well.
Yeah. I love this idea that, in a sense, it's, again, Clay as this Venn diagram of I've got all this knowledge and material about innovation, how else can we apply it? And the question is also, and it's sort of almost full circle back to how will you measure your life? It's how does Clay, you guys, apply it to things that really matter
right.
in this sort of development. And that must tie into, I guess, your work with Banyan and that sort of thing. So is there almost in your trajectory as this writer exploring these, I mean, you've almost skirted this, as you describe it, hardcore business world, publishing, ink, legal stuff, and now writing and talking about our own lives and how they matter, but also the work that we do in business, how that matters. How are you changed by this process of writing over this past decade?
Oh, it's an interesting question. So I think I'm interested in as many things as I used to be. I think maybe when I was younger, I was much more focused on accomplishing things, but now I'm much more focused on ideas and things that personally interest me and challenge me. So I'm drawn to things by my own personal connection or interest with it, and I might not have been when I was younger. I was doing whatever the assignment was or whatever the brief was. But I also I have learned this over the years. There's an interesting story in almost everyone and almost every topic. And I think it shows lack of imagination to not be able to write about virtually any topic in an interesting way, in a way that people can connect with. So I find it actually exciting and a fueler of my imagination to have a disparate range of things that I do want to write about. Family business is a new topic for me, and it's interesting and it's complicated, and there are all kinds of psychological elements that you wouldn't think about, as well as hardcore, how do we connect with people as innovators? So I actually find it an exciting challenge, making all of these topics engaging to average people, because I think average people, when they understand something, then they can use the idea in their own lives, and I think that's a powerful thing.
Yes, and so this is a great springboard into as we pull this to a close now. the ideas that you would urge other executives, other entrepreneurs who, for whatever reason, want to write a book. We've picked up a few. We've got the idea of, some core idea, some germ that really has to be told, but packaged in a way, framed in a way that is really attractive and engaging. So some sort of key question. But what sort of advice would you give someone, an entrepreneur, an executive, anybody wanting to write a book that matters? And I don't know, maybe picking up on some of the things you've touched on in the last few minutes. What's your advice to anybody considering writing a nonfiction business type book?
Well, I think first you have to think about why you want to write it. If you want to write a book because, and I understand this, you want your name on the cover of a book that's in the library and on coffee tables and your mother will be proud of. Okay, it's a lot of work for that goal, but I understand it. But you then are not as likely to connect with people. So if that's your motivation, be honest with yourself, and maybe that's a vanity book, or maybe you do it in a different way. If your goal is really to share an idea that you're genuinely excited about, and you want other people to talk about it and think about it and have it as a tool to work with, that's a much better motivation. So that's fun. And then the second thing I say to people, the idea of writing is very daunting to many people, physically writing. And I think perfectly great storytellers and thinkers sort of sabotage themselves by trying to write too quickly, sitting down at a computer and writing as they think they're supposed to write. I often find people are best when you just talk to them. Tell me, it's what I do with Clay. Tell me why this is interesting. Tell me a story. Imagine that you're sitting at a holiday dinner table and someone says, what are you working on? How do you make it interesting for them? It's almost like, don't get yourself stuck by thinking you have to go straight to a keyboard. Dictate, talk about it into your phone and then get it transcribed. I think we almost overcomplicate our ideas because of the need to demonstrate and prove and be logical and rigorous. First, start by engaging me and interest me. And I think people can do that. Professors generally, in my experience, are great on their feet. And then they make it a lot harder for themselves when they sit at the keyboard. I think that's true for a lot of people. So tell your story before you think about writing it. And maybe even speaking is a great way to start. Can you entertain an audience with your idea? Are they engaged by it? Look at their faces. Do they light up? Do they seem to be asking questions in their mind? When you've hit with an audience. That's a really good first step to saying, do I have an idea that people really will be excited to share?
Yeah. Lovely ideas. It's just come to me, this idea of being an author sometimes gets in the way. I want to be an author to write something. And yet author is to be someone who tells the story. We talk about auditing electives at Harvard or wherever it might be. So it's much more about hearing the story from the source, it seems to me, than necessarily sitting down and writing. Love what you say. Thank you so much for sharing your time today. How can people reach you if they want to find out a bit more about the work that you're doing?
Sure. Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm receptive to invites on LinkedIn, and I have my own website, karendillon.net. And you can follow me on Twitter at KARDillon, at KARDillon. But I love to hear from people, and I particularly love to hear from people who are interested in sharing ideas and have found some of our ideas engaging and have ideas to share back. I'm very interested in that.
Awesome. Listen, thank you so much for your time, and we'll catch up again. I have a ton more questions about other topics. Talk to you again soon.
Good to talk to you.
Listen, thank you very much.
Whoa. Brain explodes. What a powerful set of ideas. I hope you can see now, as we start to get into the actual mechanics of writing, there's so much more that we have not touched on in this summit. And so if you want to hear more on these themes, how do we make our writing engaging, inspiring? What are the practical tactics and techniques that we can use? And I love that, almost the last one, the holiday meal. What are you working on at the moment? To speak out the story, to tell your story before you write it, maybe even to speak on stage somewhere and just see if you can get a reaction, and which parts of the story get a reaction. That is a very practical technique. A couple of insider thoughts there. The idea that publishers, if you're thinking about going with a mainstream publisher for your book, publishers have a portfolio approach. Like a pharmaceutical company, they create 20 drugs and one of them has to be a blockbuster. Publishers also have a portfolio approach. They want to say, for every 3 or 4 or 5 books, one of them has to hit, but the others we can just fund. So that I didn't appreciate that before. So I think also what I find reassuring in Karen's story is that you can write about any topic in an engaging way. It's about your story to an extent, but it's about finding the stories that make the ideas live. So no matter how prosaic, how ordinary you feel or you fear your topic is or your area of interest, it can be made engaging and inspiring, and probably you will find that more as you talk about the idea with other people, as you talk the ideas through on stage, or as you speak in front of a camera. Put a photograph of your nearest and dearest in front of the camera and start just speaking the ideas out. I do find the conversation, though, with somebody asking questions, what do you mean by this? Can you give me more examples of that? That works really well for me. Let's have a little look. A reminder too, right from the beginning, that a book is the deepest possible connection you can have. If you're trying to influence somebody from a business perspective or change their mind, if it's a more personal issue, a book is the deepest connection, deepest form of connection you can have. They are literally holding your work and taking your ideas in through their eyes. If it's through an audiobook, they're listening to you. Your words are in their head. That is a powerful communication mechanism. This is a strong thing to do, a strong thing to do. And also, again, from the end, this idea of ask yourself why you're doing this. Of course, we all want our name on a book. We all want to see our work on a shelf. But ask yourself why you're doing it. Is it because the topic is interesting to you and matters to you? So I would say, in sort of pulling this session to a close, the idea of course, I want you to write a book. I want you to write a good book. But I want you to write a book that matters. No matter how prosaic, no matter whether you're writing a book for as a business development exercise. Do you remember Daniel Priestley in one of the other summit talks talked about a book can replace a full-time business development person. Even if you are trying to write a book that acts as a silent salesperson for you, make it a book that matters. And that means you put your heart and soul into it. Because after all, it's not just logic that persuades people. You need to win people's hearts as well as their minds. And that I think we can do. If you have the number of hours that somebody will spend with you holding your work in their hands, they're going to be persuaded by that journey that you craft, that pathway that you lay out in front of them as you take them from point A to point B. So think carefully about that. I've had a blast doing these summit interviews, and I can't believe we're on the edge of the very last one. In the next summit interview, the last one, we're coming full circle to where we started. If you remember, we started with LYNDA Gratton, the very first interview, and in the next interview, it's with Steve Piasanti, who's the founder of Berrett Kohler Publishers. And one of the other things Karen talked about is having a good editor, someone who can really put your words down and get them really crafted. I'm talking and doing this slowly. I'm a guy. I can only do one thing at a time because I wanted to just show you before we close what LYNDA Gratton, the very first speaker in the summit, has to say about Steve Piasanti. Let's see if I can make this work. Here we go. This is LYNDA Gratton's thoughts on Steve Piasanti.
I moved to Berrett Kohler, who, by the way, are fantastic publishers, and Steve Piasanti, who runs Berrett Kohler, in my view, is the best editor I've ever had. Most editors don't do anything at all.
Oh, I'm going to have to come to camera too. So LYNDA Gratton really thinks very, very highly of Steve Piasanti. So I look forward to seeing you on that interview session. That will be in 15 minutes. I'm going to be taking a very quick break and kicking off again at 4 o'clock British summer time. Look forward to seeing you then. And look, take a break. You need a break. I need a break. If I need a break, you need a break. Talk to you again soon. Here's the Matrix.